If you ordered a pint in Britain in the 90s, the chances are you ordered a Boddingtons, the pale gold bitter with the thick, creamy head that arrived looking nothing like a bitter and tasting like nothing else in England. At its peak, the Strangeways Brewery in Manchester was producing 850,000 barrels a year, over 240 million pints, exported to more than 40 countries. They survived the arsenic poisoning epidemic, survived the Blitz, a direct hit on the water tanks that stopped brewing for 7 months, survived a hostile takeover and the upheaval of the beer orders. They adapted and they endured. And then, after 227 years of continuous brewing on the same Manchester site, the brewery went silent. How does a brewery that survived everything the 20th century threw at it simply disappear? What really happened at Strangeways? Chapter 1. The Miller's Son. The story begins with a piece of tax avoidance. In 1778, two grain merchants named Thomas Caister and Thomas Frey looked at a patch of scrubland north of the River Irk and saw something no one else had seen: a loophole. Every grain miller inside the Manchester town boundary was obliged to crush their malt at the school mills, a monopoly held by Manchester Grammar School. The fee was unavoidable, unless, of course, you built outside the line. Caister and Frey did exactly that. They raised their brewery just beyond the New Bridge Street boundary, ground their own malt, and paid nothing. It was an act of cheerful defiance that gave Manchester one of its longest-running industrial enterprises, 227 years of continuous brewing on the same patch of earth. Manchester in 1778 was on the edge of something enormous. The cotton trade was about to remake the city into the world's first industrial metropolis, and the men who would fuel that transformation, mill hands, dock labourers, the new urban proletariat pouring in from the countryside, would need feeding. Beer was food. Beer was wages. Beer was consolation after a 12-hour shift in a place where the air tasted of soot and the river ran black. The brewery passed through a succession of quiet partnerships: Frey, Hole and Potter by 1800, Hole and Harrison by 1835, each one competent, none remarkable. The man whose name would outlast them all arrived from an unlikely direction. Henry Boddington was born on the 18th of December, 1813, in a mill cottage in Teme, Oxfordshire. His father John was the village miller, parish overseer, surveyor of the roads, and master of the workhouse, a man of grinding respectability who could barely keep his 8 children fed. Southern milling was dying. Henry's elder brother John went north first, finding work as a clerk at the Strangeways Brewery in 1831. The rest of the family followed. Henry joined the firm in 1832, aged 18, as a commercial traveller, riding out across the cotton towns with samples and order books. His lost autobiography, quoted in Michael Jacobson's 200th anniversary history, tracked the fates of 7 young men who'd started out alongside him. Most failed. His own brother John fled to corn and provisions, emigrated to America, and died penniless. Henry drew the textbook Victorian conclusions: rise at 5, be cleanly in person and dress, practice sobriety and chastity. He was God-fearing, methodical, and ferociously hard-working. His break came through one fortunate marriage. On the 8th of July, 1847, he married Martha Slater, daughter of William Slater, a Salford dyer and banker. Within a year, backed by Slater money, Henry bought a partnership when Samuel Hole left the firm. 5 years later, in January 1853, again with Slater capital, he bought out the Harrisons and became sole proprietor of the Strangeways Brewery. He was 39 years old, an Oxfordshire miller's son who'd married well and worked harder than anyone else in the room, and he'd just acquired what would become the largest brewery in Manchester. He bred 8 children with Martha and 4 more with his second wife, Eliza Nansen. He died in 1886 at his retirement home in Silverdale, leaving an estate of almost £150,000, around 19.5 million in today's money. Not bad for a man who'd been one missed loan away from oblivion. Chapter 2. The Hive of Industry. Under Henry Boddington's ownership, the brewery didn't just grow, it transformed. Output exploded from 10,000 barrels a year in 1853 to over 100,000 by 1877, placing Strangeways among only 30 breweries in Britain producing at that scale, and the largest in Manchester by a considerable margin. By then, the firm owned 71 freehold and 32 leasehold pubs, and employed 238 men and boys across the brewery, central offices, an outpost in Burton-upon-Trent, run by Henry's son, and depots in Birmingham, Rochdale, and Crewe. Henry loved new technology. In 1877, Boddingtons became the first business in Manchester to install a telephone line between two of its sites, a detail the local press reported with undisguised wonder. The water came from artesian wells sunk over 300 feet through sandstone, which the company claimed was the secret to the beer's distinctive flavour. Whether that was science or salesmanship, the water was cold, clean and plentiful, and it gave Strangeways something that no rival could precisely replicate. After Henry's death, his son William Slater Boddington took the chair. The company went public in 1888 as Boddingtons Breweries Limited, with assets of £320,000. By 1892, it owned 212 public houses, the 12th largest tied estate in the United Kingdom. In 1900, the company introduced the two Bs and a barrel logo still used today, a pun on the family name and a tribute to Manchester's coat of arms, the bees representing the city as a hive of industry. The century that followed tested Strangeways in ways that should have destroyed it. The 1900 English beer poisoning epidemic killed around 70 people and sickened at least 6,000 across northern England, poisoned by arsenic-contaminated brewing sugar. Boddingtons was among the implicated breweries. They survived. The Great Depression collapsed working-class beer demand across the industrial north. They survived. On the night of the 22nd of December, 1940, German bombs scored a direct hit on the Strangeways water tanks. Brewing stopped for 7 months while Hyde's Brewery, a smaller rival in Moss Side, brewed Boddingtons under licence. A remarkable act of mutual aid in wartime Manchester, and one that would echo, in bitterer circumstances, 60 years later. The post-war rebuild made Strangeways famous in brewing circles. The company installed what it claimed were the first stainless steel brewing vats in Europe, a quiet piece of innovation in a city that was rebuilding itself from rubble. By the 1950s, bitter had overtaken mild for the first time, and Boddingtons was perfectly positioned. In 1961, the London giant Whitbread bought a 13% stake. Then, in 1969, Allied Breweries launched a hostile takeover valuing the company at £5 million. Chairman Charles Boddington's response became one of the most quoted defences in British brewing history. "You are still, at this moment in time, a shareholder in one of the remaining independent brewery companies," he wrote to shareholders. "The takeover of Boddingtons and its consequent elimination can achieve very little." Whitbread played White Knight, raising its stake to 23%. The chairman of Whitbread is said to have told Charles Boddington, "You are a very old firm. You have a very good name. You mustn't go out." It was the first time a regional brewery had beaten off a national bid on the emotional argument, and it quietly positioned Whitbread as the company that would, 2 decades later, buy the brewery outright. Charles's son Ewart, Stowe and Trinity Cambridge, an organ scholar, born in 1927, took over in 1970. Under his stewardship, the 1971 Boddingtons Bitter became, in the Observer's phrase, a sort of cult brew, championed by beer writer Michael Jackson as one of Britain's outstanding bitters. It was pale straw gold, astonishingly light in colour for a bitter and aggressively hoppy. It looked like lager and tasted, fans said, like nothing else in England. But the world was shifting. The beer orders of 1989, the government's response to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, required the Big Six brewers to divest pub estates above 2,000 and allow tenants at least one guest beer. The intended effect was to break up vertical monopoly. The actual effect was the opposite. National brewers exited brewing entirely, and the industry consolidated into a handful of multinationals. In October 1989, Ewart Boddington sold the Strangeways brewery and the brand to Whitbread for £50.7 million. Some family board members opposed the deal. Ewart pressed it through. Whitbread wanted, as the company put it, a credible national cask ale brand. The Boddington Group kept the 450-strong pub estate. Brewing at Strangeways was now the property of London. Chapter 3. The Cream of Manchester. The Strangeways Brewery sat at the corner of New Bridge Street and Great Ducie Street, in the shadow of Alfred Waterhouse's Victorian prison. It was a sprawling red brick complex anchored by a 55-metre brewhouse chimney that was, until its demolition in 2010, the most visible landmark on the city's northern skyline. Inside, the brewing day began before dawn. The coppers boiled twice a day, and the malt smell, sweet, biscuit-rich, slightly sulphurous on wort days, soaked the Strangeways streets and rolled south across the city centre on northwesterlies. Older Mancunians still remember walking past on the bus to school and knowing what day of the week it was by the wort. The brewery was a clock and a calendar. It told the neighbourhood what time it was and what season. The product those coppers made was deceptively simple. Modern Boddingtons Bitter was 3.8% ABV, original gravity 1034, a grist of roughly 85 to 96%, pale malt with English Fuggles, Progress, and East Kent Goldings hops. The beer was pale straw gold and aggressively hoppy in its original cask form. The creamy head was a function of the Strangeways yeast, multi-strain, jealously guarded, and a tight sparkler on the hand pump. It was sold cheap, and it was sold proudly. Drinkers called it bodies. At its largest, the brewery employed around 280 workers. Brewing was multi-generational. Fathers and sons worked the mash, the bottling line, the cooperage. The cellars carried yeast cultures the brewers fiercely protected, and the sample room tested every brew for clarity and flavour. Trade union membership ran through the Transport and General Workers Union, whose regional organiser Franny Joyce would later become the public face of resistance to the brewery's closure. Whitbread inherited a sleepy regional brand with only 5% of sales outside the Northwest. Their plan was straightforward: take it national. Production expanded from 200,000 barrels in 1989 to 850,000 by 1995, a fourfold scale-up in 6 years. National distribution went through Whitbread's 7,000 pub network. By 1993, only Tetley and John Smith's outsold cask Boddingtons in Britain. The campaign that defined the era was created by Bartle Bogle Hegarty in London, running from 1991 until 1999, under the tagline, "The Cream of Manchester." The original brief was the ultimate smooth drinking pint. BBH's response was to treat creaminess as glamour and undercut it with broad Mancunian humour. The first television advert in 1991 starred model Debbie Carr, rubbing the beer head into her cheek like face cream while James Coombs, the Cadbury's milk tray man, leaned in with the line, "By heck, you smell gorgeous tonight, Petal." The 1992 follow-up parodied the Walls Cornetto gondola advert, shot not in Venice, but along the River Irwell at Victoria, with Anna Chancellor a year before 4 weddings and a funeral playing Gladys Althorpe. Director Jeff Stark had her smear lipstick across her cheek after wiping the foam. The makeup artist protested. Stark kept it in. Caruso sang O Sole Mio over factory chimneys. Then, in 1996, the agency cast a previously unknown model from Mossley, Melanie Sykes. The 1997 ice cream van advert, filmed in the Mojave Desert with athlete-actor Ken George, was the centrepiece of an £8 million campaign launched on the 20th of September, 1997. "Do you want a flake in that love?" became one of the most quoted advertising lines of the decade. Sykes' career as a national television presenter began with that ad. The campaign won, by the marketing director's own count, 50 awards including the International Practitioners Advertising Award, Marketing Week Brand of the Year, a BAFTA for comedy advertising, and multiple Cannes Lions. By the late 90s, art director Simon Robinson and copywriter Joe Moore were running posters without the Boddingtons name or logo at all, just photographs of the cream theme on black backgrounds. The brand had become so recognisable, it didn't need its own name. The Guardian's Stuart Jeffreys argued that the campaign was a major contributor to the rebranding of Manchester itself, third behind Manchester United and Coronation Street, in lifting the city's national profile. Whitbread Chief Executive Peter Jarvis put it more simply: it was very fortuitous that the brewery was in Manchester. It would be difficult to have a cream of Wolverhampton. In 1991, Boddingtons launched its canned variant with a plastic widget to deliver a draft-style creamy head. Canned bodies became the highest-selling canned bitter in Britain, a position it held from 1992 until 2000. The brand rode the Manchester wave alongside the Stone Roses, the Happy Mondays, and early Oasis. To outsiders, Manchester was suddenly the coolest city in Britain, and Boddingtons was its house pint. The brand even crossed the Atlantic. On Friends, The One with All the Kissing, Season 5, Joey Tribbiani memorably name-checked the beer after a trip to London. "Oh yeah, that was good beer. I'd walk back to London for another one of those frosty bad boys." Chapter 4. A pint. Every second. The numbers from 1997 are devastating in hindsight. 850,000 barrels a year, over 240 million pints, exports to more than 40 countries, including China, Taiwan, and the West Indies. UK ale market share approaching 5%. The £8 million advertising campaign was the largest in the brand's history. An episode of the world's biggest sitcom mentioned the beer by name. At its absolute commercial peak, Boddingtons was generating record profits for Whitbread. A pint was being poured every second of every day, and somewhere behind the scenes, in offices the Strangeways workers never visited, the brand was being prepared for sale to a Belgian multinational. 8 years from this moment, the brewery would be rubble. The beer would be brewed in Lancashire and South Wales. The Strangeways yeast, the multi-strain culture the cellars had protected for generations, would be gone forever. Nobody inside those walls could see the cliff they were about to walk off. The malt smell still rolled south on the northwesterlies. The coppers still boiled twice a day. The sample room still tested every brew. But Boddingtons had become, in the phrase of beer writer Pete Brown, a fashion product, and the first rule of fashion is that the drinkers move on. Chapter 5. The Belgians. The first crack appeared in 1998, a 10% drop in sales after the peak. It didn't look fatal. It looked like a correction, a brand that had grown too fast, settling back to a sustainable level. But the pattern underneath was harder to ignore. Lager continued its long ascent through the British market. Camera purists had been complaining since the mid-80s that Whitbread's national expansion had softened the original Strangeways recipe. The aggressive English hop bite filed down for a national audience that wanted something smoother. The beer writer duo Boak and Bailey would later put it with characteristic bluntness. It wasn't really Boddingtons. It was an imposter. And then the ownership changed. In May 2000, Whitbread sold its entire brewing business to the Belgian giant Interbrew for exactly £400 million, ending Whitbread's 258-year history as a brewer. Interbrew had owned Stella Artois since the 1980s. The Whitbread deal gave it Boddingtons, Flowers and Murphy's. Sir John Hegarty, the BBH creative who'd built the Cream of Manchester campaign from nothing, said later of the new owners, "They just didn't care about the brand. They underinvested and let it rot." The advertising went wrong almost immediately. After the BBH campaign ended in 1999, Interbrew replaced it with animated cartoon adverts featuring a character called Graham Heifer, described by one trade publication as a transgender playboy cow. The spots attracted formal complaints for what one viewer called promoting bestiality, homosexuality, and drug-taking. The Cream of Manchester tagline was quietly dropped around 2002. The cuts followed. September 2002, Interbrew announced the loss of 68 jobs at Strangeways. A public outcry followed. Workers delivered a petition to Interbrew's Belgian headquarters. The company partially backed down. February 2003. The kegging facility closed. 50 jobs gone. The Strangeways workforce fell from roughly 250 to 110. August 2003. Interbrew relaunched cask Boddingtons in the northwest with a stronger recipe. The relaunch flopped. The recipe was reversed within months. In 2004, Interbrew merged with Brazilian brewer InBev to form InBev, a company that would, 4 years later, swallow Anheuser-Busch to become the largest brewing conglomerate on earth. Boddingtons, the pride of Strangeways, was now one line in a portfolio managed from Leuven. The brewery was still profitable. That fact deserves to sit on its own. Chapter 6. £12 million of Manchester. On or about Thursday the 9th of September 2004, InBev announced the closure of the Strangeways brewery. The announcement was made by Steve Cahillane, Irish-American, Harvard MBA, 38 years old, chief executive of Interbrew UK and Ireland since 2003. He would later become CEO of Kellogg's. His public justification, delivered to the trade press, was clinical. Boddington is still declining at a faster rate than the cask market. Only 10% of Boddington's production is now in cask form. An unnamed company spokesman told the Manchester Evening News that the Victorian brewery was a victim of its age, an inflexible brewery that can't bottle or can. The Financial Times told a different story. Journalist William Hall wrote on the 28th of October 2004 that the company itself had admitted the brewery was profitable at the time of closure. The closure rationale was not commercial failure, it was real estate. The Strangeways site, 23 acres of inner-city Manchester sitting at the gates of the city centre, was sold to Ask Developments and Realty Estates for £12 million. The land beneath a profitable 227-year-old brewery was worth more to its Belgian owners as vacant acreage than as a working concern. The beer could be made elsewhere. The site could not be moved. Cahillane's other public statement read like a man performing regret through gritted teeth. "We gave it our best shot. The staff have worked extremely hard, but in the end it was just not logical to continue." He cited a 14.5% drop in sales and a £14 million advertising campaign that had failed to revive volumes. He did not mention that the £14 million campaign had replaced the award-winning BBH work with a cartoon cow. Manchester Evening News reporter Paul Taylor's article that day was headlined, "How City's Pride Fell to Big Business." The Guardian followed the next morning with Martin Wainwright's "Bodies Buries Mancunian Past." Franny Joyce, the Transport and General Workers Union regional organiser who had represented the Strangeways workforce for years, told Campaign magazine, "The brewery has always sold its beer as the cream of Manchester. Now it looks like being the sour grapes of South Wales. This is just a marketing ploy to back up a manufacturing strategy." To the Daily Mirror's Patrick Mulcrone, he went further. "It's a total betrayal of not only the workforce, but also of their customers." 5 days later, after talks with Interbrew broke down, the brewery workforce voted for a 24-hour unofficial strike beginning at 10 o'clock on the evening of Monday the 14th of September. Joyce defended it publicly. Although what has happened may not be legal, it doesn't necessarily mean it isn't right. The villains in this piece are not the workforce, it is the company chasing ever-increasing profits. In November, the union voted again, this time for a 48-hour formal strike beginning on the 1st of November. An early day motion was tabled in Parliament, signed by 44 MPs, supporting the workers and a campaign to give Boddingtons EU-protected food name status, arguing it was a geographically defined product that could only legally be brewed in Manchester. The motion failed. InBev was not a British company. The British government had no leverage and showed little appetite to find any. The workers struck. The politicians signed. The petitions were delivered. None of it mattered. The decision had been made in Leuven, and Leuven didn't answer to Manchester. Chapter 7. Bitter End production at the Strangeways Brewery ended on or about the 4th of February 2005. 227 years of continuous brewing on the same site. Finished. The Science and Industry Museum sent curators in to photograph and record the final days. They took into the National Collection barrels, a beer pump, advertising material, the sample room equipment that had tested every batch for clarity, and company archives stretching back to 1883. The museum understood what was happening. The brewery's owners did not care to. Around 60 production jobs were lost in the final closure. Counting the 50 lost when the kegging facility shut in 2003, total redundancies exceeded 110. The workers dispersed into a labour market that no longer needed Manchester brewers. Some transferred to Hyde's, some followed the work to Samlesbury under InBev. Many simply left brewing. Pasteurised keg and canned Boddingtons, over 90% of output, moved to InBev's brewery at Samlesbury in Lancashire, with some production at Mega in South Wales. Cask Boddingtons, under 10%, moved to Hyde's brewery in Moss Side, the same brewery that had brewed bodies during the Blitz. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone, but the Strangeways yeast didn't travel. The multi-strain culture the cellars had protected for generations broke down at Hyde's, causing a 1/3 volume loss that was never recovered. Quality only returned when Hyde's substituted its own yeast, at which point the beer that had been Boddingtons of Strangeways ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. John O'Donnell of Trafford and Hume Camera offered the verdict the industry was thinking. What has been sold as Boddingtons in recent years is not a particularly good advert for cask ale. the recipe having been changed initially by Whitbreads and then again by InBev to make it bland and lacking in flavour. In late 2008, InBev dropped the canned Boddingtons ABV from 3.8 to 3.5%, reducing duty cost. Beer writer Andrew Jefford called the modern keg version a blandly foamy nitro keg travesty of the original. 4 months after the closure, InBev ran a new television advert set to a Happy Mondays soundtrack, trading on Boddington's Mancunian heritage to sell a beer that was no longer brewed in Manchester. Mike Thompson, former Strangeways worker and union representative, told BBC News, "This is at best cynical and at worst a slur on our great city, its heritage and the Strangeways workers. People have lost their livelihoods because of how this company has behaved. They will not be best pleased at what we can only see as pouring salt on the wounds." Stuart McFarlane, AB InBev UK president and, with a cruelty only corporate careers can produce, a former Boddingtons brand manager, told the Morning Advertiser in 2010, "I wouldn't say we've neglected Boddingtons. There is an emotional attachment to it, but we don't see it in future growth, so it's not a priority." By 2010, sales had fallen by almost 3/4 since the takeover. In March 2012, Hyde's ceased contract brewing of cask Boddingtons. The beer's association with Manchester was, at that point, formally over. Chapter 8. The silence in the wrong shape. In 2007, the main brewery buildings were demolished. The 55-metre chimney, the most visible Boddingtons landmark on the Manchester skyline, survived until the autumn of 2010, when Rafferty Steeplejacks of Stoke-on-Trent brought it down. It was never granted listed status. There was a sentimental local campaign to save it. The campaign failed, as campaigns against Belgian multinationals tend to. For 15 years, from 2007 to 2022, the site of Britain's most loved 90s, Bitter operated as an 852-space car park. In September 2022, the Manchester College's £93 million city centre campus opened on the southern part of the site, a glass and steel building housing courses in creative and digital industries. Students now study filmmaking and theatre on the ground, where Henry Boddington's coppers once boiled twice a day. To the north, developer Latimer is building 461 apartments across 2 towers. Developer Salboy purchased an adjoining section for a £195 million scheme of 556 homes. There is no plaque, no civic memorial, no statutory listed building. The Science and Industry Museum holds the archive, pint glasses, beer mats, pump handles, ledger books, accident reports back to 1883, and that is the sum of what Manchester kept. In September 2025, J.W. Lee's Brewery in Middleton, Manchester's oldest brewer, announced it had taken over contract brewing of a relaunched cask Boddingtons under licence from AB InBev. Reviews have been cautiously positive. Demand initially outstripped supply in Manchester city centre, with venues reporting younger drinkers attracted by the nostalgia. Whether this revival sticks remains unproven. It is at best a licensing deal, not a restoration. Walk past the site today and you won't smell malt on the northwesterlies. You won't hear the coppers or the bottling line. You won't see the chimney against the skyline. The prison next door is still there. The brewery isn't. Henry Boddington arrived from Oxfordshire with nothing but his father-in-law's money and a willingness to outwork everyone around him. He built a brewery that survived arsenic, the Depression, and the Luftwaffe. His descendants built a brand that defined a city's identity, launched careers, won BAFTAs, and was name-checked on the world's biggest sitcom. A pint was poured every second of every day. Then someone in Leuven looked at a spreadsheet, looked at a map and saw £12 million, where 227 years of brewing used to be. The beer is still made, somewhere in Lancashire, in a factory that doesn't smell of Strangeways, in a can that says Manchester on the label but has never been within 30 miles of the city, at 3.5%, without the yeast. Boddingtons of Manchester, the cream of Manchester, brewed in the end, anywhere but.